Welcome to Between Product and Partnerships, a podcast focused on bringing together product, partnership, and engineering leaders to discuss how to build, support, and scale SaaS ecosystems. Presented by the SaaS Ecosystem Alliance and sponsored by Pandium, an integration platform and marketplace for ecosystems.
Welcome. I'm Kelly Sarabin. I'm the Director of Marketing at Pandium and the co-founder of the SaaS Ecosystem Alliance, which is putting on this event today. Today we have Arpit, who's a great data leader, data educator. And when I first met you, I think you were leading growth at Integromat, which is now Make, and that's kind of an iPaaS tool. So tell me a little bit about your background and what you've been doing the last few years.
Yeah, so basically, over the last few years, I've been working in the data space. Primarily started with Integromat, where I built our community and then eventually led our growth team. And I also happened to set up our customer data infrastructure. I also contributed to building our partner channel partnership program, a partner ecosystem. So that was a pretty incredible experience. But data itself has evolved so much, and there's been this sort of an explosion in the data technology landscape. There's been so many new data tools and technologies that have come up in just the last 2 years, 2.5 years, and these tools are essentially solving a lot of interesting problems, and I've sort of been fascinated by the space. And over the last 2 years specifically, I've spent a lot of time, learning about these new tools and technologies, talking to founders of companies building these tools to understand the kind of data problems they're solving. There are a lot of problems that exist that people don't know about, right? When we talk about data. So that's pretty fascinating. And I write a lot about this stuff. So, I have a newsletter where I write about this stuff. And I'm also building, like a community, so to say, for people to, learn more about this stuff. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome, thanks. Well, let's jump right in. So just for the, to get us like level set and for the audience, how do you think about what data integration is and, why it is so important to SaaS companies today?
Right. So in simplest terms, right, data integration is the process of moving data from internal systems, internal databases, as well as external tools, third-party tools, to a target system. Now, the target system can also be an internal database or a third-party tool or a third-party system, right? So essentially, it's like at its core, data integration is the process of moving data between systems. But then there are other, nuances. When you're moving data, you also have to make sure that, the data is formatted correctly. It is as per the format of the data is as per what the target system expects it to be, because just moving data is not enough, right? It has to be moved in a manner that it is also accepted by the target system. It's also stored in a manner that it is usable in the future. So that is, I would say, at the core, like moving data. But then there's also a popular definition of data integration, which is essentially centralizing data, taking data from all your first-party and third-party systems and centralizing all of that data into a database, which is typically meant for analytics workflows. And this particular database is typically referred to as a data warehouse, where you're just warehousing all of your data to build sort of a central source of truth. So that is also a definition for data integration, which is becoming more and more popular, especially in the data ecosystem. And if you talk about data integration tools, people generally refer to these tools that basically allow you to extract data from source systems and store the data into a data warehouse. So yeah.
Yeah, so I think, for the people in our audience who are working on these integrated ecosystems from the perspective of SaaS companies, they tend to think about the issue of integrating with their partners, right? But I think it's really important to take a step back and think about your customer, right? So you're a SaaS company. If you're a B2B SaaS company, you are selling to a business. So it's important that before you even get to the point where you're integrating with other SaaS companies, you really understand how they're handling their data internally and what their problems are. So And, this definitely changes at scale, right? If you have like Susie's candle shop and she has, 7 employees, then, her data practices are going to look very different than, Kraft Foods or some large
Yeah.
enterprise. So, could you kind of share like your take on, I don't know if you want to start with like a mid-market business and maybe mid-market and then larger companies, sort of what does their data landscape look like internally and what are they struggling with? Like what are the big pain points? Because we know a lot of money and resources is going into this problem, and as SaaS proliferates, it's only becoming more of a challenge.
Yeah.
But what is that sort of, even let's take a mid-market business. What does that data landscape look like for them? What does that sort of pipeline of data look like, and what are they struggling with?
Yeah. So it essentially boils down to all the data sources that they like, basically the sources where data is generated for that business. So it's typically like the first party source is typically companies websites or apps, or if they have like smart devices, and then there are third party sources which are all the SaaS tools that a company uses. Now, as if you talk about a mid-market company, I don't know what the average is, but some people claim that an average company uses over 200 SaaS tools, right? So they have so many different SaaS tools. And now you have to also understand that each SaaS tool has that the data model is different, right? There is no standardization in terms of the data model. Every tool refers to users or customers differently. Like their definition of a user is different, right? So how a company takes all of this data from all of these systems, third-party systems, as well as their first-party, sources, and then stores their data in a manner that is actually usable, right? A lot of companies end up, spending a lot of resources and buying expensive tools that allow them to take all of this data and dump all of this data pretty quickly into a data warehouse. And data warehouse is also becoming more and more affordable, but that's not enough, right? Like just taking the data and dumping the data is not enough. So I think the biggest challenge, if we talk about, is not the technology. There's a good technology that's available, but the biggest challenge is to understand, like how to make all of the data that's available, how to make the data usable. How do you make it easy for the entire organization, for different teams to derive insights from the data and then drive action on that data, right? And that is a pretty difficult problem, because you cannot like dump all of the data and then figure out how to derive insights. Typically, companies need to have processes in place that allow people to, ask questions, understand what data is available, and then ask questions of the data, and then work backwards to figure out how to best answer that question. And sometimes you already have the data available to answer that question in your warehouse or your analytics system, your BI tool, or whatever your analyst is using in their day-to-day. But sometimes their data is not available, in which case, they have to like work with data engineers and, get that data into that system, right? Again, the system could be a warehouse or whatever, but essentially that whole sort of workflow where there's like an engineer is tasked with taking data from these source systems and dumping the data into a warehouse. An analyst is tasked with cleaning this data, transforming this data, and making this data usable, and then eventually building reports that are then consumed by various teams that sort of derive insights from this data. But then they also want to, like, once they derive insights, they have more questions, right? And they also want to take this data and like do something with it, right? So they want to send this data into their marketing activation tools, right? Marketing automation tools to build personalized customer experiences. So yeah, like making the data actionable is the biggest challenge, I would say. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that, related to that is sort of the real time component of data, and having accurate data move, if not in real time and close to real time, because a lot of information can quickly go out of date, and in some roles you need that actionable data in a timely manner. And I think that adds another layer of complexity for the reason you're saying, which is you can have processes and technology where, some systems don't even allow for moving data in real time, right? You just can't get it out of the system in real time. And there may not be a way around that for a business, because if the system they're using doesn't allow that through some technical way, then you are going to have to find a way to work around that delay. So, I think that component of not only getting actionable data, but getting it to people when they need it. Because so many times, even if you have good data, if it comes to you later past the point of actionability, there's really doesn't meet the business need and purpose. And I think the other core challenge is just the surplus of data. As you noted, there's so many systems that are being used. And, when you get in larger organizations, ideally, they're all being tracked by some centralized system, but they're not always. Sometimes people just go rogue in certain business functions because they're trying to meet their own goals and metrics, and they're look at it as this system will enable me to. And as software gets cheaper, I think that becomes more possible, where someone can just try out different systems, but then you have a problem of moving data across the organization in a way that's accurate if you have some systems that aren't even on the radar. But one of the
I think I would like to
go ahead.
Sorry. I would like to mention one other challenge. So what you said makes a lot of sense, and one big problem, like besides what I already mentioned, is making sure that when with data integration, one thing people forget is that integrations break, right? No matter how good they're built, they tend to break for a variety of reasons, right? So when your pipelines break, you have to have systems in place that notify you when a pipeline breaks, because oftentimes you realize that something's broken, but you realize that much later, only to see that a lot of the data has been lost, right? So that is a very common problem, even for small businesses, even businesses that are just trying to move data from their CRM into like your marketing automation tool, and then there's a change in the API, and then something breaks, or like you said, a user goes and changes something in the tool itself, right? They change the way a certain sort of object is defined, and that sort of breaks the integration, and nobody realizes it until you actually have tools. There are certain tools that help you do this, observability tools that sort of monitor your pipeline, and as soon as something breaks, they'll notify you. So that is a significant problem. And as companies build more and more pipelines, as they integrate more and more tools, these problems are only sort of becoming more severe, right, and more critical.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's a huge challenge. And I think that's a challenge for SaaS companies as well, in terms of if you are going to provide product integrations to your customers, how do you keep up with all those changes? Yeah. And also, are you notifying your customers? Are they being alerted when something breaks? Yeah. Because as a business user of business systems, I can say there's many cases where I've used product integrations provided by a system, and I was not alerted when they broke. And then you find it like a day or two later. And me as a marketer, I may have lost a lot of registrations. If you don't respond to a demo request quickly, you lose a certain number, right? So that stuff is key, and it can provide a bad user experience. But
definitely,
So I think these terms ETL, ELT, and reverse ETL are something that most people have sort of heard and sort of key to the data industry, but a lot of people don't know exactly what they are or how they're different. Can you kind of elucidate that?
Yeah, so in my head, it's really simple, right? So ETL stands for extract, transform, load. And the concept of ETL goes back to like, I think the 70s. So it's not a new concept at all. And it essentially means you extract data from your source systems, typically third-party tools. And then before you load the data into a target system, which is your warehouse where you want to sort of analyze the data, you go through a transformation process to make sure that when the data lands in the lands in the target system, it is exactly how analysts or data scientists would want it to be, so that they can put that data into action, as in they can start using the data, so they can start analyzing the data, or like building models and building algorithms. So the transformation step, it was a huge step, right? So ETL was essentially, like you figure out exactly what the data should look like, and then once you extract the data, you transform it, and only then you load it. Now with ELT, what the biggest shift has been in the way, firstly, data warehouses have become cloud native, and today more and more companies are embracing cloud data warehouses like Snowflake or BigQuery or Redshift, and data warehouses have also become much cheaper and faster. So companies have figured that it's easier and faster to just ELT all the data, which means extract and load all the data first, and then take care of transformation, right? So this is a good thing and a bad thing, actually, because the good thing is obviously, all the analysts, they don't have to like really wait for engineers to make it available. The data is already available and is being loaded on a regular basis, sometimes even in real time if you have real time use cases. And then they can use newer technologies such as DBT, which is basically a data transformation framework, which allows analysts to write SQL queries and transform the data and like maintain version control and do all of the good stuff that enables them to be more productive. So that is like a big shift, but the downside is also that like there's a lot of data being stored, and there are challenges, right? When there's too much data, like that there are more requests, and analysts are sort of constantly trying to fulfill those requests, and they're also sort of overburdened, because like they have literally no excuse, right? All of the data is there, and they have to constantly sort of transforming the data and building models and then making sense of the data. And reverse ETL is essentially taking this data, the transformed data from the warehouse, and then putting it back into third-party tools, right? And that's why it's called reverse ETL, where you're doing the opposite of ETL. You're still extracting the data, but this time you're extracting it from your warehouse, and then you're loading it into your third-party tools. The transformation is already taking place, so it's not exactly ETL. It's transformed data, and then it's EL, and it's mainly done to make this clean, actionable data available in downstream systems where data is eventually activated. So think marketing automation tools, even CRMs or sales engagement tools, all your advertising channels, Facebook, etc., where you want to send data about your users. And this could be near real time if you need it to be, depending on different sort of technologies you're mixing reverse ETL with. So there are real-time databases that reverse ETL tools connect with that allow you to move this data in near real time, or reverse ETL tools can be connected to your typical data warehouse, and then you can move this data in a batch process on a schedule. So all of this boils down to essentially moving data. It's still just moving data from a source system into target system, but because organizations are collecting more and more data, and storing data is becoming cheaper, moving data is becoming cheaper, there are all of these different technologies sort of coming up that are enabling organizations to move faster in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think that was a great overview of sort of the landscape. And I'd be curious how you think product integrations from SaaS companies tie into that picture, because a good product integration, but really any product integration should be doing that some for you, right? So it's extracting the data from Salesforce, it's transforming it, and then it's loading it into HubSpot, for example. If you had an integration, and you as the business user don't need to do anything, and presumably nor does your data analyst. Now maybe they're taking data out of both Salesforce and HubSpot independently, but for that particular motion, they presumably don't have to do anything. And you also see more and more business systems integrating to data warehouses directly. So, you can take your Salesforce data and go straight into a data warehouse once you set it up. So how is that, how are businesses looking at that? Are they saying, this is a good thing that we can get some of the work off of our plate and, enable some of the business users to not need us as much? Um, what's your take on sort of the interplay of those internal data management and analytics and the SaaS product integrations that we do all know they're proliferating, right? Like there's more and
Yeah.
more SaaS integrations being offered and used.
Yeah.
Where that's going to end up, who knows? But we have seen a trend.
Yeah. So, this goes back to my experience at Integromat also, where for us, it was really about empowering the business user to connect all of these systems, right? If there was a native integration, you would obviously use it, but if there wasn't, you would use Integromat to sort of make that connection. How I like to think about this is I believe there's this sort of like a divide between data teams and like business teams or GTM teams, go-to-market teams, where for a data team, data is really there to sort of answer questions, right? So they want the data to be, properly formatted, properly transformed, and made available in the warehouse in a certain manner so that they can like derive insights from the data, build reports, and answer people's questions. Whereas for a business user, it's not just about answering questions. Data is also a tool to like build better customer experiences, right? And that's why integrations are so important, right? So it's about building better customer experience, but also about improving internal workflows, right? A lot of internal workflows are improved when you connect these systems together. And when you connect these systems together, essentially you're just making sure that when data is generated in system A, it's automatically moved to system B and also available in system B. Whereas if you don't do that, if you don't sort of set up that integration, you'd have to later manually extract data from system A, typically as a CSV file, and then upload the data into system B, which is inefficient and error prone. So these business integrations are extremely important. If you talk about SaaS companies building these native integrations, even from a company's, from a strategic point of view, it's really important to offer good integration because that is one of the best ways to ensure that you sort of prevent churn. Customers that typically use a lot of integrations are unlikely to switch from your product to your competitor's product. So those business integrations are extremely important, and the role that tools like Integromat play here is also very, very important because a lot of users would typically, like even I'm a user of Integromat, I'm a customer today, but I first look at the available native integration that a SaaS tool offers, right? If I think that like the tool will do my job, I'll definitely use that, right? There's no fun in just building the integration yourself if there is an integration that's available. But typically these native integrations are they solve the more common use cases, right? So they're not like super deep. So if you have a more customized use case or a more advanced use case, then that's when you sort of use tools like Integromat or Zapier or whatever. Typeform is a very good example. They have really neat native integrations that they're super quick to set up, right? And doing the same thing using a third-party tool is easy, but it's still sort of it's a waste of time, and you end up spending more money, and things can break, right? So, so I hope that answers your question. But essentially, these business integrations, native integration between SaaS tools are extremely important to the business persona. But if you talk about the data person, they actually prefer that these point-to-point integrations don't exist because there is a sort of a downside also, right? When a lot of these point-to-point integrations exist, and then the data team is tasked with taking all of the data from all of the source systems and dumping that into the warehouse for other purposes. They struggle because then they find that there's a lot of data is duplicated, there's a lot of missing data, and it just increases work for them. So I think it just boils down to what a business's priorities are, right? Today, if you want to enable your business teams to move faster and like get things done faster and not like, rely on external people, then you do want to give them these capabilities, and you do want to give them access to these tools that allow them to do more without relying on other teams. I'm a huge proponent of empowering business teams and GTM teams, and that's my background is also in go to market. I don't really have a background in data per se, right? So I have personally benefited a lot from having access to these tools and being able to like connect these tools and integrate these tools and build workflows that sort of enable me to also experiment, because if you think about it, no one really gets it right in the first attempt, right? They build an integration, they run it, they sort of benefit from it, and then they try to optimize it and they improve it. Like at Integromat, we saw this all the time, right? You start with a very simple, 2 or 5-step integration and can turn into a 20-step or 50-step, sometimes even 100-step integration. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, so I was intrigued that you said for data analyst it can be a downside. So I want to unpack that a little bit more. If you have like an integration set up directly between, say, HubSpot and Salesforce, wouldn't that make the data in those two systems, if anything, slightly more aligned than if there was no integration? In which case, from the perspective of the data analyst, who's probably pulling the systems from both systems, regardless of whether there's an integration, is that really adding complexity for the analyst to have that integration existing?
Yeah, so again, it depends on how that integration between HubSpot and Salesforce has been set up, right? If it's like a native integration, which is just literally, let's say moving leads from one to the other, should not be a problem. But let's say I'm an advanced user and I'm using something like Integromat, and then I'm doing some funky stuff. I'm transforming the data. I'm changing the date format, or I'm doing stuff that enables me to sort of improve my own workflows, right? Where I'm customizing their integration, right? I'm not just doing like a one-to-one mapping. That could be challenging when data is extracted from these two systems and brought together into a centralized repository. And typically a warehouse, and then they see like sometimes it doesn't add up, or sometimes I might want to only move data from system A that matches certain rules to system B, right? Like moving data from system A and applying certain rules, which means that not all of the data would be available in system B, right? So there will be some discrepancy here because there might be more leads in Salesforce and less leads in HubSpot, right? Or the stages, they might be set up totally differently. They might be called something else. So those things can become a challenge when the analyst is tasked with building like a report, which takes data from the systems and consolidates everything, because for them, it'll be hard to figure out, what is the actual number of leads, or, what is the actual status of a particular lead, because it shows something else here and shows something else there. So these challenges, and there could be many other challenges, like when you build these point-to-point integrations, things tend to break, and you don't always tend to realize that, and you don't always tend to fix those things.
Yeah, no, I think you can, especially when you're either using middleware, or even if somebody independently got someone to build an integration, in which case then you can introduce a lot more complexity and transformation. And I also agree that if since integrations do break like any other app, you can then introduce discrepancy where some of the data moved, but some of it didn't, and you thought that it did, and then you have an inaccurate sort of pipeline set up to that. One thing I've noticed in the last few years is business buyers becoming a lot more savvy about integrations. I think a few years ago, people in pre-purchase would just be asking, do you connect to Salesforce, or do you connect to Zendesk? And salespeople would be like, yeah, it's great, we do. And then they would go ahead, and then they would find out 6 months later that actually the integration wasn't very robust, or it was through middleware, and the middleware had a very simplistic offering in terms of what it could do between those two systems. But my sense is that businesses have started to get more savvy. I guess they've been burned. They realize that, hey, this is something just like the product that you should be, if it's important, you should be scoping it out before you purchase. But I'd be curious if sort of that's what you've seen in the last few years as well.
Yeah, I mean that's a pretty common problem, right? Because as a SaaS company, unless you're in the business of providing integrations, integration is always like I would say it's like a necessary evil, evil because it's a pain, right? Because integrations is hard work to like maintain integrations. It's not hard work to build those integrations, but it's hard work to make sure that your integrations are up to date. They adhere to like API changes, and like you mentioned earlier, you make sure that if something breaks, you actually inform your customer. And a lot of businesses choose not to do that, right? And then the second challenge is that if you talk to engineers, they don't actually like to build integrations because it's very monotonous work. I've personally tried to at one point in time, I was trying to hire engineers to build more and more integrations for us at Integromat. It's pretty challenging because people don't enjoy doing that, right? It's very repetitive. So yeah, and so I think to answer your question, it's a really common problem where the buyer will want certain integrations, and typically they just look at, like, let's say they look at the integration directory and they say, okay, your tool XYZ integrates with whatever tool I'm looking to use it with, right? But there's a second challenge, right? Like, just because A integrates with B doesn't mean it actually solves your needs, right? So you have to also see how deep that integration is, right? Often those integrations will be very basic. Like I mentioned earlier, we'll cover a very common use case, right? But let's say you want to integrate let's say you want a certain sort of object from your source system, and there is an API, right? So if you talk to the salesperson, you're like, yeah, it's totally possible, right? We have an API for that. But it doesn't mean that they actually offer native integration that sort of pulls data from that endpoint and makes it available into your target systems. So there's a lot of gray area over here, right? Where everything is literally possible as long as there's an API. Things are possible. A lot of times APIs are available, but they're not publicly available. So it's also like a sales tactic to offer integrations or offer APIs as part of a specific deal where they might offer you an API that's not publicly available, but then it's on you to sort of make that API work with whatever system you want it to work with. So and I think this will continue to be a challenge until there is some sort of a universal standard or like a unified API that we've talked about before. A lot of companies have tried to solve this problem. It's a really hard problem because also, like with a lot of companies, priorities change, right? Some, like, I don't want to take names, but there've been large acquisitions in the data integration space, and when these acquisitions take place, a lot of those a lot of the integrations that were on the roadmap, they become, they literally disappear, right? So if you're, as a customer, you're relying on a certain tool, and that it works well with another tool that you use, but all of a sudden it stops working, right? They stop updating that integration, and they literally tell you, you need to go and talk to vendor B, and then vendor B says, oh, we didn't build that integration, you need to talk to vendor A. So these problems, I think, will never really go away. And as a buyer, I think it's important that you understand what your integration needs are sooner rather than later. It's not just enough to say that I want to integrate A with B, but you also need to understand and know, like, what exactly do you want to do when you say you want to integrate, right? What data do you want to move, and how you want to make the data available? Do you want the data to move in real time, or do you want to move it on a batch, on a schedule, or do you just want to move it once in a while, right? So I think these sort of questions need to be asked of vendors when you're evaluating tools, and that'll hopefully make it less painful as a buyer in the long run.
Yeah, and I think SaaS companies need to ask that as well, because SaaS companies often look to integrations and native integrations that they're building as a way to increase retention, and
Yeah.
and that does work, and we've seen that. But the problem is, if you build an integration that doesn't address your customer's use case, they may sign a contract thinking that they can do it, but then ultimately it can even increase churn if it's such a bad
Yeah.
experience to a key system. So I think SaaS companies need to really scope out those use cases, treat it like a product feature, do the research entailed to make sure that you're actually meeting the needs of the user instead of just saying we connect these two systems. But
Yes.
you mentioned this before earlier in terms of, one of the problems around having hundreds of systems, each with their own data models, that adds difficulty and complexity. And, I think we've seen with external APIs, they've sort of moved very heavily towards using REST and OAuth 2, which is not as common as REST, but is being used more and more. So that's happened organically, right? And I think it's partly for the reason you're saying, which is it's hard to find developers to work on this. And so if you can use a standard that a lot of developers already know, you are going to get more people willing and able to work with your API. But, I've seen in the sort of product integration space, some companies crop up calling themselves unified or universal APIs. Now, all the ones that I know of are vertical specific, because it's obviously easier to unify data models around a set of systems that at least have underlying realities that are same, versus say trying to unify QuickBooks and Salesforce, which are doing two pretty different things. But what's your take on sort of the state of unified APIs right now, and where it might be able to go? Is that just a pipe dream, or is it possible someone's going to come up with a universal API, or would that have to happen in like an open source organic way versus a company being able to put it forth and have adoption?
Yeah, so I would say like there have been attempts, right? A lot of people, a lot of companies have sort of tried to solve for this and try to attempt, building like a universal standard. And typically, they've taken the open source route. So I haven't really seen like a successful unified API company, but there are a couple of things that I'd like to mention. So Stitch Data created this standard called Single, which was basically a standard for companies to build integrations on top of, which would enable the end user to very easily, quickly extract data from a lot of these third-party systems and do whatever they wanted to do with the data. And essentially, it was like a standard for companies to build on top of, right? So it was trying to build this, like we talked about, like an open source framework or a standard. If every company would adopt that, then extracting the data from different tools and actually unifying them would be a lot easier, right? But that didn't quite sort of take off, because eventually Stitch Data, which was an ETL, it is an ETL company, was acquired by another ETL company, and then that open source project sort of gradually sort of died down. Another company tried to revive it. They said we're gonna build on top of it, but that again didn't quite work out. And then there's this a new company that has come up called Airbyte, which is also an ELT company, which says that we'll not only embrace the Singer standard, but we'll create a standard of our own, which will enable companies to build integration with our product really fast and enable our customers to basically integrate with all kinds of systems. So this is not exactly a unified API like what I'm referring to, because like you said, a unified API seems like a pipe dream, because all of these systems are so different, their models are so different, and now SaaS tools are also becoming more extensible, so the customer is becoming savvier, and they're personalizing or customizing tools a lot more, right? So like a unified API that understands all of these systems and then transform the data in real time, and then like makes the data available into all of these systems again is really challenging, right? So I would say I'm not really an expert here because I haven't really worked with a unified API company. I've never used one. I haven't really come across a super successful one. But if you talk about data integration, there have been attempts, and people are still trying to build these standards. So Airbyte is also open source, and it's just a 2-year-old company, but they've seen a pretty good adoption. They're a pretty active community, and a lot of people are basically building these connectors, right, with an array of tools. So if you're using Airbyte, you can not only like use one of the pre-built connectors, but if you're sort of familiar with the standard, then you can actually build a connector pretty quickly, and then transform the data in your warehouse again, and then send it back to your destinations or system where you want to utilize the data. So yeah, it's not exactly, like I said, a unified API solution. If someone can sort of build that, it'd be really amazing, but we'll see how that plays out.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I think that was a lot of awesome information about data. Is there a place people can go on social to find you?
Yeah, definitely. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So if you just find me on LinkedIn, I can automate, also on Twitter, or they can go to astorik.com. In fact, they can go to ask.astorik.com, which is essentially a place for folks to get answers to their data questions directly from experts, and from me as well. So I have my own, community on Astorik, and there are other experts who have their own, micro communities on Astorik where folks can learn from them and then ask them questions. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the content, subscribe to our channel and give us a thumbs up. If you're someone who is working on building and scaling SaaS product partnerships, we invite you to apply to be a member of our community at saasecosystemalliance.com.